This week we're focusing on the concepts of sex and gender, examining some of the theories behind gender roles, that is, the nature versus nurture debate, and how such concepts become culturally embedded. Let's begin with some definitions. Sex is the term used to describe the inherited biological differences between males and females. Based on differences in genitalia, reproductive organs, and chromosome patterns, there are two commonly recognized sexes, but we're learning more about intersex variations, that is, someone born with male genitalia and ovaries, or a chromosomal variant beyond XX or XY. Gender, on the other hand, involves the culturally constructed ideas about sex differences, that is, the behaviors, interests, and expectations we place on people based on their expressed gender. In this sense, gender is viewed as a spectrum with many different manifestations. The documentary you watched about Mushe women living in Oaxaca is one such example, as well as the two spirits and hijras described in this week's readings. There are people who fall into the category of who fall into the category of transgender because their gender identities or performances do not align with the cultural norms related to their sex assigned at birth. These definitions and examples are important because they cause us to evaluate and question the types of gender roles that we commonly recognize in our society. From your perspective, what roles do males and females hold in Western societies? Can you think of any gender reversals? What did you come up with? How about a male hairstylist or nurse? Perhaps a female mechanic or a marine. With the passage of time, many of these so-called gender reversals are no longer viewed as such, and occupations have become less restricted in terms of gender categories. Even among non-Western societies, we find examples of gender reversals, such as the women soldiers of the Dahomey Kingdom in Western Africa. The Dahomey king ruled over a complex society and was protected by female warriors, who went on to inspire the Black Panther comic series and film. The examples we've discussed so far are focused primarily on the occupations associated with gender roles, but what about the responsibilities of caring for children or the elderly? In a famous court case, Moritz versus the Commissioner of the IRS, Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued before the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals that Charles Moritz, an unmarried man who claimed a tax deduction for the cost of a caregiver for his invalid mother, which the IRS had declined. She argued that Moritz was discriminated against due to his sex and that a new precedent should be set against such discrimination. The law that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was arguing against sought to give a benefit to people who had to care for dependents, but only if the caregiver was a woman or a widower. But why only if it was a woman? Because we assume that only women are caregivers. Or at least most people did back in the 1970s. This was a monumental decision that contributed to a series of such rulings that Ruth Bader Ginsburg sought to secure in her battle for gender equality. The film, On the Basis of Sex, is a great dramatization of this effort. More recently, we've witnessed the passage of more legislation that recognizes the equal roles both parents play in raising their children, such as the 2018 law in Iceland granting mothers and fathers 3 months of parental leave after the birth of their child. All of this leads up to the question, where do gender roles come from? The question of where gender roles come from is central to what is commonly referred to as the nature versus nurture debate. In other words, is human behavior determined by our genes or our life experiences? On the one hand, some say that gender is pre-wired and biologically determined, while others think that the influence of experience and learning, that is our culture, is what determines our gender. A simple way to remember the difference is to consider the phrase, "boys will be boys," which assumes that boys and men act in certain ways because they are biologically male and are thus pre-wired to act in those ways. New research, however, is expanding our understanding of how gender identities are formed biologically and why our minds and bodies do not always align. It has to do with when our brains and reproductive organs form during fetal development, and it's absolutely fascinating. The TED Talk by Carissa Sambonmazzo explains this research much more clearly than I ever could, so be sure to watch that video when you're done here. Oh, sorry, it's behind on my clicking. Bringing us back to culture, that is, the patterns of learned and shared behavior and beliefs of a social group. From an emic perspective, we accept a set of norms or rules about how society functions and the roles people play. Deviations from these patterns make us uncomfortable, but we are adaptable. While our social and environmental setting influence our behaviors and attitudes, we too are able to change our world by expanding our worldview. For example, gender reveal parties have become a thing in recent history, and while I don't always agree with the extravagance to which some people go, we as a society know based on these photos that the couple on the left are having a girl because of the strong cultural association between little girls and the color pink. Same thing for the cake. We all know which side signals the baby is a boy or a girl. So I ask you to consider, does this mean that we start constructing a baby's gender based on their biological sex before they're even born? What influence does this have on how they grow up? These questions allude to the nurture side of the debate. We learn our culture in two primary ways, through transmission or diffusion. Cultural transmission is a process of learning or social reproduction. We can see in the photos here that the young kids are imitating the behavior of the adults around them. This is how we transfer cultural norms or traits onto the next generation. This process involves conscious and unconscious learning, the reinforcement of cultural norms and positions parents and educators as important influencers. Cultural diffusion is not as common, but there are plenty of historical examples due to colonization efforts. It involves the transference of cultural norms onto unrelated groups or individuals, such as the assimilation of Native American children into American or Western society by cutting their hair, changing their clothes, and sending them to boarding schools. Unlike transmission, this is often a forced or coercive process, and from the opposite perspective can sometimes involve cultural appropriation. When it comes to cultural transmission, I mentioned the reinforcement that parents give their children to conform to accepted gender normative behaviors. That is why the pink toys are given to girls and the camo-colored toys are reserved for boys only. We socialize our children in specific ways, and then we reinforce those behaviors. In the socialization process, children are introduced to certain roles that are typically linked to their biological sex. Girls, for example, are seen as mothers or cooks, while boys are involved in activities outside of the home or are off saving the world as superheroes. Socialization, in this sense, is a mechanism of cultural transmission. It helps children internalize the norms and ideologies of their society and what their society expects of them. Next, I'd like you to move on to the Crash Course in Sociology video that discusses the theories of gender.